The dust settled on the parched earth like a death shroud, choking the last breath of hope from Faith Remington's cracked lips as she stared at the withered cornfield that had once been her family's pride. 1882 had brought nothing but misery to Douglas, Arizona territory, and Faith was beginning to believe that God himself had abandoned this forsaken corner of the desert. Faith leaned against the rickety porch railing of her homestead, gazing at the horizon where the merciless sun had begun its descent, painting the barren landscape in cruel shades of orange and gold. 3 years of drought had transformed what was once fertile land into a wasteland of broken dreams and empty promises. At 25, she had already lost more than most folks twice her age, her parents to typhoid 2 years prior, her younger brother to a mining accident last winter, and now, it seemed, her farm and future as well. "Miss Faith, Mrs. Garrett called from down the path, her plump figure huffing up the dirt road with a basket in hand. The widow was one of the few neighbors who still bothered to check on Faith, though there wasn't much anyone could do against the cruel hand of nature. "Brought you some preserves and a loaf of bread," Mrs. Garrett said, placing the basket on the porch table. Her eyes darted around, taking in the emptiness of the farm, the desiccated fields, and the thinning livestock. "Town meetings tonight. You ought to come, dear. Mayor's bringing in some fellow who claims he can help with the water situation." Faith forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Another snake oil salesman with promises of rain. I think I'll pass, Mrs. Garrett. This one's different, they say. Some kind of engineer or expert from back east. Studied water in places even drier than Douglas, if you can believe it." The older woman patted Faith's arm. "What have you got to lose by listening?" What indeed, Faith thought after Mrs. Garrett had gone. Her gaze traveled to the small family graveyard on the hill. 3 crosses stood as silent sentinels, marking where her mother, father, and brother rested. She had buried them all herself, the ground so hard and unyielding that each shovelful felt like a personal betrayal from the land they had loved. With a resigned sigh, Faith decided Mrs. Garrett was right. She had nothing left to lose. The town hall was packed when Faith slipped in through the side door. Mayor Jeffries stood at the front, his handlebar mustache quivering with each word as he introduced the stranger beside him. The newcomer stood tall and straight-backed, with broad shoulders that filled out his simple but quality clothing. He wasn't dressed like the typical traveling salesman who occasionally passed through Douglas with their fancy suits and slick promises. "Folks, this here is Mr. Owen Burke," the mayor announced. "He's a hydrologist from Boston who's been working with the Department of Agriculture on irrigation techniques for arid regions." The man stepped forward, removing his hat to reveal thick chestnut hair and a face weathered by sun and wind. Faith estimated him to be in his early 30s. His eyes, a striking shade of blue that reminded her of the sky before the drought, scanned the crowd with quiet confidence. "Thank you for welcoming me to Douglas," he began, his voice deep and measured, lacking the frantic enthusiasm of a con man. "I won't waste your time with promises I can't keep. The situation here is dire, but not hopeless." Faith found herself drawn to his calm demeanor as he unrolled maps across the table and explained concepts of watershed management, underground aquifers, and irrigation techniques he'd implemented in similarly parched regions of Nevada and New Mexico. "The natural water flow in this region follows ancient pathways," Owen explained, his finger tracing lines on the map. "Your town has been trying to farm and ranch according to methods that work well in wetter climates, but Douglas needs its own approach." Mayor Jeffries cleared his throat. "Mr. Burke has agreed to stay on for 3 months to implement his water management plan. He's asking for volunteers to help with the labor and perhaps some lodging. He can stay at the Remington place, someone called out, and Faith turned to see old Mr. Peterson pointing directly at her. That farm's got the best access to the eastern water table according to his fancy map, and the girl's all alone out there anyway. Faith felt her cheeks burn as all eyes turned toward her. Before she could object, Mayor Jeffries was nodding enthusiastically. Excellent suggestion. Faith's land would be perfect for the demonstration project, and there's that old bunkhouse where the ranch hands used to stay. Owen Burke's eyes found Faith's across the room, and something in his steady gaze kept her from voicing her protest. Instead, she found herself giving a small nod of agreement, wondering if she had just invited trouble onto her land or, perhaps, its salvation. The next morning arrived with the same punishing heat that had greeted Douglas for months. Faith woke before dawn, as was her habit, to tend to the few chickens and the old milk cow that had somehow survived the drought. She was hauling water from the well, which produced less each day, when she heard the sound of horses approaching. Owen Burke rode at the front of a small procession that included the mayor, the blacksmith, and several men from town carrying tools and equipment. Burke dismounted with the easy grace of someone who had spent considerable time in the saddle, contradicting Faith's initial impression of him as an Eastern academic. "Miss Remington," he greeted her, hat in hand. "I hope you don't mind us arriving so early. I wanted to get started before the day's heat." Faith straightened her back. "It's your show, Mr. Burke. The bunkhouse is over there," she said, pointing to a small structure about 50 yards from the main house. "It hasn't been used in a while, but the roof doesn't leak." "Thank you." "I don't require much," he replied, then hesitated. "I was hoping you might show me around your property. Your knowledge of the land would be invaluable." For the next hour, Faith guided Owen around the boundaries of her 160-acre homestead, pointing out the creek bed that had been dry for 2 years, the best grazing areas in normal times, and the spots where water sometimes lingered after the rare rainfalls. She found herself surprised by his genuine interest in her observations and the questions he asked that showed respect for her experience. "Your father chose this land wisely," Owen commented as they stood atop a small rise overlooking the property. "The natural contours of the land channel water through here, or would if there was any to channel." Faith glanced at him sideways. "My pa always said we were blessed with good land. Feels more like a curse these past years." Owen studied the horizon thoughtfully. "Nature gives and takes, Miss Remington. Our job is to understand its patterns and work with them rather than against them." "Pretty words don't make rain, Mr. Burke," Faith replied, unable to keep the bitterness from her voice. Instead of taking offense, Owen simply nodded. "No, they don't. That's why I prefer action to words." He pointed to a depression in the land about a quarter-mile from the house. "That's where we'll start digging tomorrow." The men from town began work the next day, following Owen's directions to dig a series of trenches and small dams that seemed random to Faith, but which Owen assured her followed the natural water pathways of the land. They worked from dawn until the heat became unbearable, then resumed in the late afternoon. Faith kept her distance at first, tending to her own chores and watching the activity with skeptical eyes. On the third day, curiosity got the better of her, and she approached the site where Owen was measuring depths and marking the ground with stakes. "What exactly are you trying to accomplish with all this digging?" she asked. Owen wiped sweat from his brow with a bandana. "We're creating a system that will capture and direct any rainfall more efficiently, preventing runoff and allowing the water to penetrate deeper into the soil." "But there hasn't been rain for months," Faith pointed out. "It will come," Owen said with such quiet certainty that Faith almost believed him. "And when it does, we'll be ready." As the days passed, Faith found herself increasingly drawn into Owen's project. She began bringing water and food to the workers, then offering suggestions about the land that Owen received with genuine appreciation. By the end of the first week, she was helping to dig trenches herself, her sleeves rolled up and dirt smudging her face. "You're quite the worker, Miss Remington," Owen commented as they paused for a drink of water. "Most ladies I've met would faint at the thought of such labor." Faith took a long drink from the dipper. "I'm not most ladies, Mr. Burke, and this is my land. If there's hope for it, I want to be part of making that happen." Something sparked in Owen's eyes at her words. "Call me Owen, please. And there is hope, Faith. I promise you that." The following days fell into a rhythm. Work began at dawn, paused during the hottest hours, and resumed until sunset. Owen took his meals with Faith in her kitchen, their conversations gradually shifting from the technical aspects of water management to more personal matters. Faith learned that Owen had lost his wife and infant son to fever 5 years ago, after which he had thrown himself into his work, traveling from one drought-stricken area to another, helping communities find water where none seemed to exist. "It's become my purpose," he explained one evening as they sat on her porch watching the stars emerge. "Water is life, bringing it back to people who have lost hope. It feels like honoring their memory somehow." Faith felt a connection to this man who understood loss as intimately as she did. "Does it get easier?" she asked softly. "The grief, I mean." Owen's gaze remained on the stars. "It changes, becomes a part of you rather than something that consumes you." He turned to look at her then. "Your land reminds me of my family's place in western Massachusetts. Different in every way, but one it was loved. I can see your family's love in every fence post and floorboard." Faith felt tears threatening and quickly changed the subject. "Tell me more about these cisterns you want to build next." After 2 weeks of intense labor, the first phase of Owen's plan was complete. A network of channels now crisscrossed Faith's property, all leading to a central depression that had been deepened and lined with clay to create a small reservoir. Stone-lined trenches connected this to the dry creek bed, which had been cleared of debris and strategically dammed in places to slow any potential water flow. "Now we wait for rain," Owen announced to the gathered townspeople who had come to see the completed work. "And if it doesn't come," someone called out. Owen's expression remained steady. "It will. But while we wait, we'll move to the second phase, accessing the underground water." The following day, Owen showed Faith and the volunteer workers his plans for digging a new well, deeper than the existing one, and positioned at a spot where his calculations suggested they might find a more reliable water source. "The water table has dropped, but it's still there," he explained. "We just need to go deeper to reach it." The work was harder than the trench digging had been. Each foot of depth required hours of labor, removing dirt and rocks, shoring up the sides to prevent collapse. Faith worked alongside the men when they would allow it, her determination earning her grudging respect from even the most traditional among them. One afternoon, as Faith helped sift soil samples Owen had collected from different depths, she noticed him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "What is it?" she asked, brushing hair from her face with a dusty hand. "You," he said simply. "Most people in your situation would have given up by now, sold the land for whatever they could get and moved on." Faith looked around at the homestead that had been her entire world. "This land is all I have left of them, of who I was, who we were as a family." She met his gaze directly. "I can't explain it, but leaving would feel like another death." Owen nodded slowly. "I understand that better than you might think." That night, Faith couldn't sleep. She tossed and turned, thinking about Owen Burke and the strange feeling of hope that had begun to take root inside her. It had been so long since she'd allowed herself to hope for anything that the sensation felt almost like pain. Near midnight, she gave up on sleep and stepped outside onto the porch. To her surprise, Owen was there, leaning against the railing and looking at the sky. Trouble sleeping? He asked without turning around. Faith joined him at the railing. Too many thoughts. About water, she admitted. Some about other things. Owen turned to face her then, and in the moonlight, Faith could see a warmth in his eyes that made her breath catch. "I've been thinking too," he said quietly, "about how remarkable you are, Faith Remington." Before she could respond, a distant rumble sounded from the west. Both of them froze, hardly daring to believe what they were hearing. Then a cool breeze touched Faith's face, the first cool air she'd felt in months. "Is that?" she began. Owen's face broke into a wide smile. "Thunder," he confirmed. "And that smell in the air, that's rain coming." They stood transfixed as the distant rumbling grew louder. Then, on the far horizon, they saw it flickering lightning illuminating the underside of massive clouds moving toward Douglas. "It's really coming," Faith whispered, hardly daring to believe. Owen took her hand in his. "The first test of our system," he said with a mixture of excitement and anxiety. "Let's hope we built it well." The storm hit with a vengeance that seemed to make up for months of absence. Rain pounded down in sheets so thick that Faith could barely see past her porch. Owen dashed back to the bunkhouse to retrieve his oilcloth coat, then returned to stand with Faith, both of them watching in awe as water cascaded off the roof in torrents. "We should check the channels," Owen shouted over the downpour. "Make sure they're working as intended." Without hesitation, Faith grabbed her father's old rain slicker from a hook by the door and thrust her arms into it. Together, they ventured out into the storm, lanterns held high, checking how the water was flowing through their carefully constructed system. The channels were working beautifully, directing the rushing water away from areas where it might cause erosion and toward the central reservoir, which was rapidly filling. The previously dry creek bed now carried a robust flow, slowed at strategic points by the stone dams they had built. "It's working," Faith cried, her face wet with rain and tears of joy. "Owen, it's really working." In the midst of the storm, with rain plastering her hair to her face and mud caking her boots, Faith felt something break free inside her, a dam of emotion held back by years of struggle and loss. She threw her head back and laughed, a sound of pure relief and happiness that rang out even above the storm. Owen watched her, his own face alight with shared joy. Then, in a moment that seemed both inevitable and surprising, he stepped forward and pulled her into his arms. Their lips met in a kiss that tasted of rain and promise, of endings and beginnings. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, Owen rested his forehead against hers. "I didn't come here looking for this," he said softly. "For you." "I wasn't looking either," Faith replied. "But here we are." They stood together in the pouring rain, watching as water brought life back to the parched earth of Faith's farm, and perhaps to their hearts as well. The storm continued through the night and into the next day. Faith and Owen took turns checking the water management system, making adjustments where needed and watching with satisfaction as the reservoir filled to capacity and began spilling over into the secondary basins they had prepared. By the time the rain finally stopped, nearly 2 inches had fallen, more precipitation than Douglas had seen in the previous 6 months combined. The transformation was immediate and dramatic. The dusty brown landscape took on a hint of green as dormant seeds, long buried in the soil, responded to the moisture with tender shoots. "It will take more than one storm to break the drought," Owen cautioned Faith as they surveyed the property. but it's a start." Faith nodded, her eyes tracking a pair of meadowlarks that had appeared as if by magic, hunting for insects brought to the surface by the rain. "It feels like a miracle." "Not a miracle," Owen said, taking her hand. "Just science and hard work and a little bit of faith." He smiled at the double meaning. Word of the successful water capture system spread quickly through Douglas. Farmers and ranchers from miles around came to see what Owen had built, asking questions and taking notes to implement similar systems on their own properties. Mayor Jeffries began talking about expanding the project to include the entire town, perhaps even creating a communal reservoir for irrigation. For Faith, the transformation went beyond the physical changes to her land. The weight of isolation and despair that had pressed on her for so long began to lift. She found herself smiling more, planning for the future again, and most surprisingly, falling in love with the quiet, thoughtful man who had brought not just water but hope back into her life. One evening about a month after the first rainfall, as they sat on her porch watching the sunset reflect off the now permanent pond where the main reservoir had been, Owen took Faith's hand in his. "I've been offered a position with the Territorial Water Commission," he said. "They want me to implement similar systems throughout Arizona." Faith felt her heart sink. "So you'll be leaving soon?" Owen's fingers tightened around hers. "That depends entirely on you, Faith Remington." She looked up at him questioningly. "I've known many places and helped many people," Owen continued, his voice low and earnest. "But I've never found anywhere that felt like home, not since I lost my family. Until here. Until you." Faith's breath caught as Owen slid from the porch chair to one knee before her. "I know it hasn't been long," he said, "but some things you just know, deep down where it matters. I love you, Faith. I love your strength, your determination, the way you refuse to give up on this land when anyone else would have walked away." From his pocket, he produced a small silver ring with a delicate blue stone. "It was my grandmother's," he explained. "Faith Remington, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Of building something here that will last long after we're gone?" Tears sprang to Faith's eyes, but unlike all the tears she had shed over the past 3 years, these were tears of joy. "Yes," she whispered, then louder. "Yes, Owen Burke, I will marry you." As he slipped the ring onto her finger, another rumble of thunder sounded in the distance. They both looked up to see clouds gathering on the horizon once more. "More rain coming," Owen said with a smile. Faith leaned down to kiss him. "It seems to follow you wherever you go." Their wedding took place 2 months later in the Douglas Town Church, with nearly the entire community in attendance. The drought had not fully broken, but with 2 more significant rainfalls and the implementation of Owen's water management techniques on several neighboring properties, a sense of cautious optimism had replaced the desperation that had gripped the town. Faith wore her mother's wedding dress, carefully altered by Mrs. Garrett and the ladies of the sewing circle. Owen stood tall and proud at the altar, his eyes never leaving Faith as she walked down the aisle on the arm of old Mr. Peterson, who had stepped in to give her away. "Dearly beloved," the pastor began, "we are gathered here today to witness the union of 2 souls who have brought hope back to our community. Through their combined strength, faith, and knowledge, they have shown us that even in the darkest times, new beginnings are possible." Faith and Owen exchanged vows, promising to stand by each other through whatever challenges lay ahead. When the pastor pronounced them husband and wife, cheers erupted from the congregation, a celebration not just of their marriage but of the renewed spirit that had taken hold in Douglas. The reception was held at the Remington farm, now showing signs of recovery with green shoots emerging in the fields and water flowing in the once dry creek. Tables were set up under the old oak tree, and everyone contributed food and drink to the celebration. The town's only musician played his fiddle while couples danced on a wooden platform constructed for the occasion. "Mrs. Burke," Owen murmured in Faith's ear as they swayed together to the music. "How does it sound?" "Like the beginning of something wonderful," Faith replied, resting her head against his chest. As night fell, lanterns were lit around the property, casting a warm glow over the festivities. Faith noticed Owen in deep conversation with several men, including the mayor and a distinguished-looking stranger who had arrived that morning on the stage from Tucson. Later, Owen pulled her aside, his expression excited. "That man talking to Mayor Jeffries is Calvin Thompson from the Department of the Interior. He's been sent to evaluate our water conservation methods for possible implementation throughout the Arizona territory." Faith's eyes widened. "That's wonderful, Owen. There's more," he continued. "He's offered me a position as chief water engineer for the entire Southern Territory. It would mean traveling to establish similar systems in other drought-affected communities." Faith felt a moment of concern. "How much traveling?" Owen squeezed her hand reassuringly. "Some, but with Douglas as our home base, and I told him I have a partner who knows as much about this system as I do." "Me?" Faith asked in surprise. "You," Owen confirmed. "We built this together, Faith. I couldn't have done it without your knowledge of the land and your willingness to try something new. Mr. Thompson is quite intrigued by the idea of a husband and wife engineering team." Faith laughed, imagining the faces of the staid government officials when they realized one of their engineers would be wearing skirts. "Well, that would certainly be different." "Different is good," Owen said, pulling her close. "Different is what saved this farm, what brought us together." As their guests began to depart, calling out well wishes and congratulations, Faith and Owen stood arm in arm on the porch of what was now their home. The night sky was clear and filled with stars, but far on the horizon, clouds were gathering again. "More rain coming," Faith observed. "A blessing," Owen replied, "but not the greatest one I've received this year." He turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. "I came to Douglas thinking I would bring water to a dying town. I never expected to find life again for myself." Faith rose on tiptoe to kiss him softly. "We saved each other, I think." 6 months after their wedding, the rains had returned to a more normal pattern in Douglas. The reservoir systems built throughout the town and on neighboring farms ensured that every precious drop was captured and used efficiently. Fields that had been abandoned were green again, and a sense of prosperity had returned to the community. Faith and Owen divided their time between managing their own growing farm and traveling to other communities to implement similar water conservation systems. Their reputation spread throughout the territory, and requests for their expertise came in regularly from towns as far away as New Mexico and Texas. One evening, as they returned home from a 2-week journey to a struggling settlement near the Mexican border, Faith dismounted from her horse with unusual weariness. Owen was at her side immediately, concern etched on his face. "Are you all right? You've been quiet all day." Faith smiled mysteriously. "I'm more than all right, just a little tired from the trip and from carrying a passenger." Owen's brow furrowed in confusion. "A passenger? What do you mean?" Faith took his hand and placed it gently on her stomach. "A very small one. One who should arrive sometime next spring." Owen's expression transformed from concern to wonder in an instant. "A baby? We're having a baby." Faith nodded, laughing as Owen lifted her off her feet in a joyous embrace, spinning her in circles on the yard that was now green and alive where once there had been only dust. "Put me down, you fool," she giggled. "That's no way to treat your pregnant wife." Owen set her gently on her feet but kept his hands on her waist. "A family," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Our family." That night, they sat on their porch as had become their custom, watching the sunset paint the western sky in brilliant hues of orange and gold. The land stretched before them, transformed by water and care from a dying wasteland into a thriving homestead. Where once dry creek beds had cracked under the relentless sun, clear water now flowed. Fields that had been abandoned to dust now showed promising growth for the coming harvest. "Do you ever think about how different things might have been?" Faith asked, her hand resting on her still flat stomach. "If you hadn't come to Douglas, if the town meeting had been held on a different night, if old Mr. Peterson hadn't volunteered my farm." Owen considered this, his arm around her shoulders. "I think some things are meant to be, one way or another. I was searching for something I couldn't name, and so were you. We might have found each other by a different path, but I believe we would have found each other nonetheless." Faith leaned her head against his shoulder. Like water finding its way underground, no matter what obstacles lie in its path. "Exactly like that," Owen agreed, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Speaking of paths, I've been thinking about the future. With the baby coming, we might want to consider building an addition to the house." Faith smiled at his practical nature, always planning, always looking ahead. "I'd like that. Maybe add a proper study for your maps and drawings, and a nursery, of course. And perhaps in a few years, another addition for the next little Burke," Owen suggested with a grin. Faith laughed. "Let's get through this one first." They sat in comfortable silence, watching as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. The sound of water flowing in the creek created a soothing background melody, a sound that still seemed miraculous after so many months of silence. "I never thought I could be this happy again," Faith confessed softly. "After losing everyone, I thought that part of my life was over." Owen tightened his arm around her. "Life has a way of surprising us, of flowing in new directions when old paths are blocked. Like your water systems," Faith mused. "Like my brilliant wife," Owen corrected, "who had the courage to keep going when most would have given up. Who gave a stranger a chance to prove himself. Who taught me that helping others heal could heal my own heart as well." In the months that followed, Faith and Owen prepared for the arrival of their child while continuing their water conservation work. Faith's expertise grew until she was as knowledgeable as Owen about the technical aspects of hydrology, while he learned from her about the practical realities of farming in arid conditions. Together, they developed new methods that combined scientific principles with generations of hard-won knowledge. As Faith's pregnancy progressed, they traveled less but welcomed a steady stream of visitors to their farm. Government officials, farmers, and engineers, all eager to learn from their success. The Remington Burke water management system, as it came to be known, was documented in agricultural journals and recommended by the Department of the Interior for implementation throughout the drought-prone regions of the American West. Spring arrived with an abundance of wildflowers carpeting the desert in colors Faith had never seen in such profusion. The creek flowed strong and steady, fed by winter rains and protected from evaporation by the series of stone-lined pools and shaded channels Owen had designed. Their fields promised a bountiful harvest, and the orchard they had planted the previous autumn showed signs of healthy growth. On a warm April morning, with birds singing in the cottonwoods along the creek, Faith gave birth to a son they named Thomas James Burke Thomas, after Owen's father, and James after Faith's. He came into the world with a lusty cry that made the midwife laugh. "That one's got a voice like thunder," she declared, placing the swaddled infant in Faith's arms. Owen, who had paced anxiously outside during the delivery, was summoned inside. The expression on his face when he first saw his son was one Faith would remember for the rest of her life, a mixture of awe, love, and a fierce protectiveness that mirrored exactly what she felt herself. "He's perfect," Owen whispered, gently touching the baby's dark hair, so like his own. "Absolutely perfect." Faith smiled tiredly. "He has your chin, and I think your stubborn nature too, judging by how long he took to arrive." Owen laughed, tears glistening in his eyes. "Let's hope he has your strength and determination. He'll need both in this world." As Thomas grew from infant to toddler, Faith and Owen expanded both their family enterprise and their conservation work. The addition to the house was completed before Thomas's first birthday, providing not only a nursery, but also the study Owen had wanted and a larger kitchen where Faith experimented with drought-resistant crops and preserved the bounty from their increasingly productive gardens. Word of their success continued to spread. 2 years after Thomas's birth, a representative from the newly established agricultural college in Tucson arrived with an offer for Owen to lecture on water conservation techniques. The position would allow him to continue his practical work while sharing his knowledge with the next generation of farmers and engineers. "What do you think?" Owen asked Faith as they discussed the opportunity. "It would mean spending a few days each month in Tucson." Faith considered the idea while watching Thomas toddle after a butterfly in their garden. "I think it's an excellent opportunity. Your methods should be taught more widely." "Our methods," Owen corrected. "And the college expressed interest in having you lecture as well, on practical applications and crop selection for arid environments." Faith looked at him in surprise. "Me? Lecture at a college?" Owen nodded. "Your knowledge is as valuable as any professor's, Faith. More so because it's been tested in the real world, not just in theory." And so, in the autumn of 1885, both Faith and Owen began occasional teaching at the agricultural college, bringing Thomas with them on their journeys to Tucson. Their lectures were well attended not only by students, but also by established farmers eager to learn new techniques for surviving in the challenging Arizona climate. Life settled into a rhythm that, while busy, brought deep satisfaction to both Faith and Owen. Their farm prospered, their conservation work expanded, and their reputation grew. Thomas grew too, a sturdy, curious boy with his father's thoughtful nature and his mother's determined spirit. When Thomas was 3, Faith discovered she was expecting again. This pregnancy was easier than her first, perhaps because she knew what to expect, or perhaps because life itself had become easier with the farm's increasing prosperity and the steady implementation of their water management systems. In the summer of 1887, their daughter Eleanor Mary Burke joined the family, arriving with considerably less drama than her brother had. Thomas, initially uncertain about this small, noisy intruder, soon appointed himself her protector and guide, proudly showing baby Ellie his favorite places around the farm once she was old enough to toddle after him. By the time Eleanor was born, the Remington Burke farm had become something of a showplace for modern water conservation techniques. The original system had been expanded and refined until it captured nearly every drop of rainfall and directed it efficiently to where it was most needed. Trees planted strategically around the property provided shade to reduce evaporation, while careful crop selection and rotation maximized yields with minimal water usage. One evening, as Faith and Owen sat on their porch watching Thomas and Eleanor play in the yard, a familiar wagon appeared on the road leading to their home. Faith recognized it immediately as belonging to Mrs. Garrett, now in her 70s, but still one of the pillars of the Douglas community. "I've brought a visitor," Mrs. Garrett called as she pulled up to the house. Beside her sat a young woman Faith didn't recognize, dressed in travel-worn but quality clothing that suggested she had come from back east. "This is Miss Catherine Wilson from the Ladies' Home Journal, Mrs. Garrett explained as the young woman descended from the wagon. "She's writing an article about women in the West, and I told her she simply must speak with our Faith." Catherine Wilson approached with a friendly smile, extending her hand first to Faith, then to Owen. "I hope I'm not intruding, but when I heard about a husband and wife team revolutionizing farming techniques in the Arizona territory, I knew I had to include your story in my series." Faith exchanged a surprised look with Owen, who nodded encouragingly. "We'd be happy to speak with you, Miss Wilson. Would you care for some refreshment after your journey? I've just made lemonade." Over the next 2 days, Catherine interviewed both Faith and Owen extensively, taking notes on their water conservation methods, but seeming even more interested in Faith's personal journey from a woman on the verge of losing everything to a respected expert whose techniques were being implemented throughout the West. "It's a remarkable story," Catherine said as they walked the property, observing how the land had been transformed. "So many women in your position would have sold out and returned to civilization, but you persevered. What gave you the strength to continue when things seemed hopeless?" Faith considered the question carefully. "I think it was a combination of stubbornness and love," she finally replied. "This land represented everything my family had worked for, everything they believed in. Abandoning it would have felt like abandoning them all over again." "And then Mr. Burke arrived," Catherine prompted. Faith smiled, watching Owen in the distance, showing Thomas how to check the water level in one of the monitoring wells. "Yes, then Owen arrived with his science and his certainty, and his quiet determination to make things better. He didn't just bring technical knowledge, he brought hope when I'd forgotten what hope felt like." Before Catherine departed, she asked to take photographs of the family and the farm for her article. They gathered under the large cottonwood tree that shaded the main house, Owen standing tall beside Faith, who held a leaner in her arms, while Thomas stood proudly between them. "Your story will inspire so many people," Catherine said as she packed away her camera. "Especially women who might be facing their own struggles on the frontier." Faith shook her head modestly. "We didn't do anything extraordinary, we just refused to give up." "That itself is extraordinary, Mrs. Burke," Catherine replied. "And the methods you and your husband have developed could change farming throughout the arid West. That's a legacy worth documenting." 6 months later, a package arrived from Philadelphia containing several copies of the Ladies' Home Journal featuring Catherine's article, titled "The Woman Who Made the Desert Bloom." The piece detailed Faith's journey from despair to innovation, highlighting her partnership with Owen and their combined expertise that had transformed not only their own land but the prospects of an entire region. "Listen to this," Owen said, reading from the article. "Mrs. Faith Burke represents the finest qualities of Western womanhood: resilience, ingenuity, and an unwavering commitment to the land she loves. Together with her husband, Owen Burke, she has pioneered methods of water conservation that experts predict will revolutionize agriculture in arid regions. Their story is not merely one of scientific achievement, but also of personal redemption, a testament to the human capacity for hope even in the bleakest circumstances." Faith blushed at the praise. "She makes us sound like heroes." "Maybe we are in our small way," Owen suggested, setting down the journal to lift a leaner into his arms. "Heroes to these two, at least, and to the people of Douglas who can grow crops again, raise livestock, build a future." Faith looked around at their home, not just the physical structures they had built or expanded, but the life they had created together. Thomas was now almost 5, already showing an interest in his father's maps and measurements. Eleanor, at almost 2, was a bright, curious child who followed her brother everywhere. Their farm produced abundantly thanks to the water management systems they had refined over the years. Beyond their own property, their methods had been adopted by nearly every farm and ranch in the county, creating a network of water conservation that had fundamentally changed the landscape. Douglas was thriving again, with new businesses opening and families moving in rather than abandoning their homes as they had been when Owen first arrived. "I never imagined my life could be like this," Faith said softly. "When you first came to Douglas, I was just trying to survive one more day, one more week. I couldn't see a future at all." Owen set Eleanor down to play with her brother, then drew Faith into his arms. "And I was just passing through, fixing problems and moving on because staying in one place hurt too much. We healed each other, I think." Faith rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "And the land. We healed the land too." "We did," Owen agreed. "But the work isn't finished. It never will be. That's the nature of this place. It demands respect and constant attention." Faith smiled up at him. "Good thing we're stubborn then." "Good thing indeed," Owen replied, bending to kiss her softly. As the years passed, the Burke family continued to grow and thrive alongside their land. Thomas followed in his parents' footsteps, studying engineering and hydrology before returning to Douglas to continue their work. Eleanor developed a passion for botany, researching plants that could thrive in arid conditions while providing food, medicine, or other benefits to the community. 2 more children joined the family, Robert in 1889 and Sarah in 1892, completing their family and filling the expanded farmhouse with laughter, arguments, music, and the controlled chaos that defines a happy home. Faith and Owen continued their work well into their later years, traveling throughout the Southwest to consult on water conservation projects while maintaining their beloved farm as a demonstration site for their methods. Their techniques were eventually adopted by government agencies and included in agricultural education throughout the country's arid regions. On their 20th wedding anniversary in 1904, the town of Douglas held a celebration in their honor, dedicating the community reservoir that had been built using their methods as the Burke Reservoir. The mayor presented them with a plaque commemorating their contribution to the town's survival and prosperity. "When Owen Burke first came to our town, we were dying of thirst literally and figuratively," Mayor Thompson, the 3rd Mayor Thompson since Owen's arrival, this one being the grandson of the original, declared to the gathered crowd. "He brought scientific knowledge, yes, but more importantly, he and Faith showed us how to adapt to our environment rather than fighting against it. They taught us to respect the natural patterns of water and land, and in doing so, they saved not just individual farms but our entire community." Faith, her hair now streaked with silver but her eyes still bright and determined, squeezed Owen's hand as they accepted the recognition. At 57, she remained active in their consulting work, though they traveled less frequently now, preferring to let Thomas handle the more distant projects. Owen, at 62, had developed a slight stoop from years of bending over maps and diagrams, but retained the quiet strength and steady demeanor that had first drawn Faith to him. His blue eyes crinkled at the corners as he smiled at his wife, still seeing in her the determined young woman who had reluctantly allowed a stranger to dig trenches on her failing farm all those years ago. "We should say something," Faith whispered as the applause continued. Owen nodded and stepped forward. "Thank you for this honor," he began, his deep voice carrying across the gathering. "But the truth is, we didn't save Douglas. Douglas saved itself by being willing to try new methods when the old ones failed. By working together when it would have been easier to give up individually. And by believing in second chances," Faith added, moving to stand beside him. "For the land, for the community, and for two people who thought their best days were behind them, only to discover they were just beginning." The celebration continued into the evening, with music and dancing under the stars beside the reservoir that now supplied water to the entire town. Faith and Owen danced together slowly, their movements familiar and comfortable after 2 decades of partnership. "Happy anniversary, Mrs. Burke," Owen murmured against her ear. 20 years. Did you ever think we'd make it this far?" Faith smiled up at him, the years falling away as she remembered their first dance at their wedding. "I knew we would," she replied. "From the moment you made it rain, I knew you were a man who kept his promises." Owen laughed softly. "I didn't make it rain. I just helped prepare the land to receive it when it came." "And me," Faith added. "You prepared me to receive happiness again when I thought I was too damaged, too dried up inside to ever feel joy." Owen's arms tightened around her. "You were never damaged, Faith, just waiting for the right season to bloom again." As night deepened, they made their way home to the farm that had been the center of their lives for so long. Their younger children, Robert and Sarah, were waiting on the porch with a small cake. Mrs. Garrett's granddaughter had helped them bake in honor of the occasion. "Happy anniversary, Ma and Pa," 14-year-old Robert called while Sarah, just turned 12, bounced excitedly beside him. Inside, they found Thomas and Alina had prepared a more elaborate surprise, a family album containing photographs documenting the transformation of the farm and the growth of their family over the years. "We found some of the earliest pictures in Ma's trunk," Thomas explained, pointing to a faded photograph of the farm as it had looked before Owen's arrival, parched, desperate, dying. "And here's after the first big rain," Alina added, turning the page to show the initial water channels and reservoir, with a much younger Faith and Owen standing proudly beside their creation. Page after page chronicled their journey, the expansion of the water system, the birth of each child, the gradual transformation of the landscape from barren to bountiful. The final pages showed the farm as it was now, green and thriving, with fruit trees, gardens, and fields of grain where once there had been only dust and despair. Faith ran her fingers gently over the images, tears gathering in her eyes. "It's our whole life," she whispered. "All here in these pages." "Not our whole life," Owen corrected, his arm around her shoulders. "Just the story so far. We have many chapters yet to write, my love." Later that night, after the children had gone to bed, Faith and Owen stood on their porch as they had done nearly every evening for 20 years, looking out over their land in the silver light of the full moon. The reservoir gleamed like a mirror, reflecting the stars above, while the soft sound of water flowing through the channels provided a soothing backdrop to the night sounds of the desert. "You ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't come to Douglas?" Faith asked, leaning against her husband's side. Owen considered the question. "Sometimes, I imagine I would have continued wandering from one troubled place to another, fixing problems but never putting down roots, existing rather than living." "And I would probably have lost the farm," Faith acknowledged. "Been forced to sell for whatever I could get and move to town, taken sewing or washing perhaps. Instead, look what we built together," Owen said, gesturing to the thriving landscape before them. "Not just a farm, but a family. A legacy that will continue long after we're gone." Faith nodded, thinking of their children who would carry on their work in different ways, Thomas with his engineering mind, Eleanor with her knowledge of desert plants, Robert with his talent for design, and Sarah with her gift for teaching others. "We gave them roots and wings," she said softly. "The security of knowing this place will always be here for them, and the freedom to follow their own paths." Owen pressed a kiss to her temple. "Just as we found our own path against all odds." As the moon climbed higher in the desert sky, Faith and Owen remained on their porch, content in the life they had built from the ashes of their individual losses. The drought that had once threatened to destroy everything Faith loved had ultimately brought her the greatest gift of her life, a partner who understood her strength and vulnerability in equal measure, who had seen possibility where others saw only devastation. And Owen, who had come to Douglas seeking only to implement his water management techniques before moving on to the next drought-stricken community, had found instead a home, a purpose, and a love that had healed his fractured heart. Together, they had transformed not just a failing farm but an entire community's relationship with the land they depended upon. They had taught respect for natural patterns, adaptation rather than resistance, and the power of working with nature instead of against it. Most importantly, they had demonstrated that even in the most desperate circumstances, with patience, knowledge, and determination, life could flourish again. As Faith and Owen finally turned to go inside, arms around each other's waists in the comfortable familiarity of long partnership, the first drops of a gentle summer rain began to fall, pattering softly on the roof of the home they had built together. Not a drought-breaking downpour this time, but a steady, nurturing rain that would soak deep into the soil, feeding roots and replenishing reserves. "Perfect timing, as always," Faith murmured, smiling up at the man who had brought rain back to her life in more ways than one. Owen returned her smile, his eyes reflecting the same deep contentment she felt. "Some things are meant to be," he replied simply, "like water finding its path, like us." Hand in hand, they entered their home, leaving the door open to the cool, rain-scented breeze, a fitting end to a day of celebration, and a promise of continued growth in the years to come.